I'm going to come to you on this because I've spoken to Jerry about this, I would say, about 1,000 times over the last couple of years. We had a red card in this game, high hit. We've seen this movie before several times. Could have been other cards, by the way. That Lowry was very lucky for tackle in the air, I think, not to get a card of some sort. But that's not so much what we're talking about here. But a high hit, red card, could have been another. Like Steve Thompson's autobiography serialised at the weekend, and again, it's absolutely harrowing reading where it brings home what we're talking about here in this sport and the damage that can be done. And he's recounting screaming at the dog and the dog not responding and continuing to scream at the dog, and looks down to see his confused 3-year-old son, and then he realises, I've been calling the dog by my son's name.
Yeah.
Or being in the kitchen with his wife and they're talking as couples talk in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And he knows that she's his wife, and he just can't remember her name. And it's utterly horrific. And he's having very dark thoughts about the request, I suppose, he's making of his wife and family over the decades to come. So it's utterly horrific, and the game is trying to change, and I think it should be applauded for the way it's trying to change. We have seen red card after red card after red card. I can't in any sport, Andy, think of such a lag in behavioural change. Like if we have a new Premier League rule, handball is being penalised. Within 2 or 3 weeks, players have adapted. Gaelic games, every league campaign, they're now big on the hand pass. Players start adapting. We're now several years into sendings off, and we're still seeing players tackle upright, shoulders into heads, red cards, shoulders into heads, red cards. It leads me to believe that defensive coaches are not coaching correct tackle technique.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation about the lag. Then again, some change is easier than others in terms of, I work in healthcare. There's been a public health campaign to stop smoking for 60 years, and it's still widespread. Some messages are harder to get across than others. I always remember the 2011 World Cup when Alan Roland red carded, well, I think it was at Warburton. Yeah. There was an overnight reaction to that. There was no lag time or adjustment, because there's a conscious decision to, well, you've made the hit, you lift and you tip. There's a very conscious decision to that. There's some of these contacts head to head are about body position, or about, sometimes you see someone slightly trip or hit contact off some other player and fall into contact, and there's an accidental element at times to it. There's a it's not obvious or not conscious that players are going in to shoulder to the face. It's a very conscious decision to tip tackle and tip the head and go beyond the horizontal, and we all became very familiar with that phrase. I think from a behavioural point of view, it was easier to implement that straight away.
Yeah.
I just think it's a very, very difficult thing to change based on the collision nature of the sport, but I think for what it's worth sticking with it. It's worth sticking with controversy, but I also think it's worth sticking on the conservative side and making the red cards continue, in order to avoid what you started out your question with, is players who have to deal with the darkness 10 years later. And I know many, some are on record. I played with Michael Lipman in Bath, who's been diagnosed with early dementia. I played against Steve Thompson, and there are a number of Irish players who aren't out on record who have grave concerns around their mental health and their cognition, and it's as a result of consistent head collisions in rugby, and they don't look back on that favourably. So I think for all the controversy and barroom conversation and radio and TV and media conversation, I think it's worth sticking with. If you've come this far, and yes, there's a lag time, but there are complexities to changing collisions.
Yes.
And I think it will come over time with consistency, and the message eventually will get across. I actually don't think, I think a lot of defensive coaches are really trying their best to get people lower in the tackle, to get you using your footwork to adapt. But ultimately it is, when you carry the ball, you want to win collisions, and sometimes in a split second there's a collision that happens that is a couple of inches off where it should have been, and yes, you got to just hit it with a red card then, I think, more often than not.
Okay, well, that's a very nuanced way addressing it. Jerry, we've talked about it a lot, so for the purposes of time, if you don't mind, I'll press on